Okay, a very important topic in statistics is this idea of correlation. And correlation is really a number that's calculated in statistics that helps us understand a few things. It helps us understand if our data has kind of a straight line pattern to it, or I should say a linear pattern to it. It doesn't mean that the data, when I plot it on a graph, it doesn't mean that it makes a straight line. It's a number that just helps me understand, number one, if it's a kind of a line pattern, and number two, how much it really looks like a straight line. So the first thing to understand and realize is correlation is a number that is between -1 and +1. So you just need to think of numbers between -1 and +1. And as you move closer to -1, the negative means that the pattern is going downhill. Or really you can think of it as a line pattern with a negative slope going downhill. If the correlation number is actually -1, we get a perfect negative linear relationship, which basically means it's a perfect line. All of my data points, when I plot them, lie in a straight line, and they have a negative slope, but they're going downhill. Okay. On the contrary, on the other side, if I get a +1 for correlation number, a +1 is telling me, hey, it's uphill, it's positive, has a positive slope, and if it's 1, it means it's a perfect line. My data, when I plot it, it makes a perfect line. And as my correlation number, moves closer to the center of this picture, closer to 0, okay, if it's 0, it means that you do not even have anything that looks like a straight line. It could be, actually a good example would be like a parabola or a curved line. If correlation is closer to 0, it means that it has no straight line pattern to it. So the picture here, the studying versus score pattern with this data, you can tell that when we talk about form, this is a linear form. It's going rising linear in a linear pattern. When we talk direction, it's going uphill, so our correlation number that we calculate will be a positive number. And this pattern is a pretty good line. It's not perfect. We have some points like these two down here that seem kind of off the mark a bit, and test for outliers, things like that. But this is a pretty good linear pattern. So I would assume that my correlation for this kind of pattern would be something closer to a +1. I don't know the number right now because I haven't entered the data. Now let's move on to just 6 examples, and this is from our textbook that gives you a correlation value for each of these. Now, R is the letter we use to represent correlation. So in this first graph, R is -0.96. So just to review, remember the negative means it's going downhill. It has a negative slope. And you can see that from the picture that the pattern is a downhill pattern. The fact that it's 0.96 is really close to 1, and close to 1 means you have data that looks like a pretty good line. And you can tell here, this is an obvious straight line pattern going downhill. That's why our correlation is close to -1. The next graph is, you can tell it's going downhill. The data points are kind of spread out here, a lot more spread than the last one, and that's why going downhill, my correlation will be negative. They're more spread out than the last pattern. It's not as nice of a line, which means it will be further away from -1. It's going to move closer to 0, and this correlation is calculated as -0.6. And the next one, you can kind of tell this pattern is kind of downhill. If you drew a box around these, it would be kind of a downhill pattern. But it's not really a good straight line, which is why our correlation number is negative downhill, but closer to 0 because it's not really a good straight line pattern. And the last 3 examples are really just going uphill. So this one is going kind of an uphill pattern. If I drew a box around these points, you can tell that the box is kind of slanted going uphill. And that is a positive correlation, positive slope, and that's why our correlation number is a positive number. But it really doesn't look like a line at all. It's kind of scattered quite a bit, and that's why our correlation is closer to 0 here, 0.19. And as these graphs get closer to being like a straight line, you can tell that the correlation numbers get closer and closer to +1. So that's kind of a quick lesson on correlation, what the number is.